I want to thank you all for appearing this evening. And just to kind of give you a little bit of background on what I'm trying to accomplish with this. First of all, I'm going to just offer you one person's perspective, i.e. my perspective, on basically the income tax cuts that Governor Brownback pushed through the legislature last year and what that means for our state budget, spending decisions, things like that, and decisions we have to make as a result of those policies changes. This is just my perspective. I am the ranking minority member of the Senate Assessment Taxation Committee. Okay, this is no way meant to be a partisan presentation or anything like that. I'm just giving you my 2 cents on what I perceive as the policy that has driven, first of all, these tax cuts that were enacted, signed into law by the governor last year, and what this means for future taxing decisions as well as spending. The purpose of tonight's objective is not to tell you my thoughts, well it is, but the purpose of my objective is to get people engaged. I want you to come to your own conclusions as far as what policy is going on, what you think about that, but the most important thing is to reach out to your representatives, both your state representatives, your state senators, and let them know what you think about what's going on in Topeka. Because folks, I can't emphasize this enough to you, there are some dramatic changes being made to tax policy, some dramatic changes being made to spending decisions there that will affect your pocketbook. And so the important thing is to raise awareness tonight, make your own conclusions and reach out and communicate to your elected representatives. So we're going to talk about, once again, Governor Brownback's his income tax cuts, basically how they came into being, the ideology behind that, components of the cuts, impact on the Kansas State General Fund. I will also tell you, you guys are my guinea pigs from the perspective of this is my first run tonight. So would like to have your feedback, once you leave here tonight. My personal email address is tomholland23@hotmail.com. So I'd very much appreciate any feedback you have as far as this presentation tonight. I like numbers. I tend to get in the weeds and ramble a little bit. So my wife, Barbara, back there is not making wild hand gestures. Maybe I get off a little beaten path or something, but I'm going to try to keep on task here. I've got a lot of slides to go through. We're going to blow through this stuff. At the end of the presentation, we'll have about 15 minutes of questions and answers, and then we'll call it a night. But once again, thank you so much for being here, and I appreciate you wanting to learn more about this issue and then reach out and communicate to those in Topeka. So we're going to talk about basically 4 things tonight. I want to talk about the Kansas tax mix. Basically, what is the mixture of taxes we have currently and how do we get there? Because I think it's important to understand where we're going to with this change in tax policy strategy that we have. I want to talk about the theory of the cuts that were put into practice last year. I want to talk about the evidence of those cuts, because and this is where I'm going to spend the bulk of my time on the presentation, because there is a particular economic ideology that is driving these tax cuts. I want you to be aware of what that is, because whether those outcomes are successful or not is going to depend upon a lot what this state looks like in the future and the investments we're making. Next, we're going to talk about the actual cuts that were put into place last year. I'm going to walk you through the cuts themselves. We're going to compare now, once those cuts have gone into place, I'm going to talk about this year's budget. One of the things that the cuts did last year is basically put a significant revenue hole, okay, in our spending projections. And so we've got to make up for those revenues. And so we're going to talk about the implications of that, what that means. Finally, we'll do the Q&A. So let's talk about basically the Kansas tax mix. When you look at basically the history of Kansas, obviously we're a state formed back in 1861. We had a situation back even prior to statehood where property taxes drove the local units of government. If you look at basically the formation of our state, back in the early 19th century, you basically had 2 schools of thought. You had basically Alexander Hamilton and this whole concept we want a strong overarching federal government with a strong taxation system supporting that. And then you had the other end of the spectrum, Andrew Jackson, Jacksonian principles. He wanted a very small, limited, controlled government. He basically wanted to have taxing at the local level. And so when you go back to actually the Wyandotte Constitution, as our state was actually coming together and forming towards statehood, you see these Jacksonian principles put into the Constitution. Quote, basically they want to have a fair and uniform property taxing system It's supposed to be very egalitarian in nature. Basically, everybody would pay taxes on their property based on what they could afford. And so this is the system that is put into place in Kansas prior to statehood, and pretty much up until the early 20th century, is our state government, well, state and local units of government, was basically exclusively driven by property taxes. The issue you have with this, however, of course, is that, once again, the Jacksonian principles of keeping government close to the people, local level, you start to see basically those local tax collectors, okay, basically not doing their jobs. They're sloughing off. They're having to keep their neighbors happy. And so you're getting a lot of inconsistencies in tax collections across the state. And so you're seeing holes in taxes and government services not being paid for. So what we have going on basically in the early 1920s is you start to see basically groups agitating, for changes to the tax code in the state. And during the 1920s, you see the Kansas Farm Bureau start organizing farmers. At that time, you've got farmers, basically, the property taxes they're paying are constituting half the total tax load. And so we see in the 1920s, we see the Farm Bureau working with these groups to start putting constitutional amendments passing through the legislature to establish an income tax system. They try this for a number of years, and finally in 1931, they, combining with the Kansas Chamber of Commerce, they work with the farmers and they actually get on a constitutional ballot, a question for the voters, and the voters actually approve it. So in 1933, then, we actually have enacted individual corporate income taxes in the state of Kansas. 1935 rolls along, the Social Security Act is passed at the federal government level, and then in 1937, to help support that act, Kansas implements something called a Kansas Retail Sales Act. And now you're seeing basically, if you've heard of this concept, you're seeing basically the formation of, quote-unquote, the three legs of the revenue stool. You're seeing the emergence of not only the property, which has been there forever, but now you're seeing our income leg and our sales tax and compensating use leg of the stool come together to form the basis of the bulk of tax revenue sources that will drive Kansas government, both at the state and local levels. During the 40s through the 80s, we see a broadening of other taxes that are adopted. Once again, we're trying to add additional tax sources to the base. So we see privilege, gross receipts, severance taxes that are added to that mix, once again bringing in additional revenues into the state and local coffers. During the 70s, the state decides to start granting the local units of government the ability to assess sales tax as well. Up until that time, they'd just been exclusive pretty much of the property. So that's when the cities and counties get that benefit. Some key changes come about basically in taxes in the state of Kansas. Up until 1986, you basically had this fair and uniform concept of property taxation throughout the state. And there's a lot of problems with that system. And finally in 86, you have voters decide basically to go through a constitutional ballot amendment, go to a property classification amendment. And this is where the state formally determines that we're going to have different classes of real property. We're going to assess different taxation rates on that property, and that is adopted. The actual classification, the property reappraisal, occurs in 1989. And maybe a lot of you folks remember this. But there was pretty much a big hue and cry that went across Kansas at that time because basically property tax burdens got shifted. And my understanding is from a number of people is that you saw homeowners, their property taxes rose significantly. A lot of commercial business owners, their property taxes rose significantly as well too as a result of that. 1992-93, we had the Supreme Court rule that Kansas's basically school finance mechanism was unconstitutional. Prior to this time, you had local school districts that were funding their own education for their school districts. And you will all know that across this great state there are huge disparities in property valuation we have in the state. So very poor areas, we're having to charge, over, say, 90, 100 mills, okay, to have the same educational opportunity, say, as the richer portion of the state. And so the court said this is unconstitutional, and then we see basically a statewide uniform mill levy enacted, originally at 35 mills, that is supposed to provide more of an equitable education for all Kansas children in the state of Kansas. So what you had is basically during the late 80s, early 90s, you had a lot of turmoil. First of all, you had certain classes of folks that saw their property taxes rising precipitously. You saw significant changes in the school finance formula, and that's got people wondering what's going on. You saw some political fallout for that. I believe it was Governor Carlin, who had been the governor during the early to mid-80s. He kind of championed that whole property reclassification thing through. He fell for his re-election bid in '86. Mike Hayden came in at that time. Of course, it was on Hayden's watch then that did the whole reappraisal process. And so you see Hayden run for re-election in 1990. He gets defeated. Hayden would also go on to run for Congress in '92, get defeated yet again for that bid. Once again, because of people who were upset about that reclassification activity that went on. But then basically along comes Governor Graves in 1995. He puts together a tax equity task force. And he basically brings in people from all across the state, different walks of life. And he's trying to get a consensus on what should Kansas tax policy be. And so what the equity task force concludes, and just, whoops, lost my thing there. Okay, got my laser pointer here. Basically, they come to the conclusion that because all revenue sources have their weakness, a balanced tax system will reduce the magnitude of problems caused by over-reliance on a single tax source. It will also result in lower rates in each task and reduce the pressure of competition from other states that have lower rates for a particular task. So back in the mid-90s, this concept of the three-legged stool is firmly entrenched, that for Kansas units of government, combined state and local units, is we're going to rely on basically these three legs, one of property, one of income, one of sales tax, to drive our governmental functions in this state. Now, I want to share with you very briefly the fact that we talk about this three-legged stool. That's the overall combined picture. When you actually look at the state of Kansas itself and its revenue sources, it is completely different because the state of Kansas itself has very little, if any, property tax receipts at all. What you see for the state of Kansas is you see the bulk of our revenue income comes from the income tax, both individual and corporate. So you've got a little bit over 50% of our state general fund revenues. The individual makes up about 47, 48%. Corporate taxes make up about 4% or so. The next big chunk we have is the retail sales and compensating use tax. And so when the governor talks about going to a zero income tax, personal income tax rate, okay, he's talking about getting rid of that 52%. Okay? Now, look how big that chunk of the pie is. So this is what we're talking about, the significance of this policy and what this means for spending decisions down the road. Move on to talk about the theory behind Governor Brownback's tax cuts. Let me get going here. And you will remember back when he was running for governor, this was in 2010, as a candidate, Governor Brownback, on campaign stops, he would make the statement, we've got to look more like Texas and a lot less like California. And so what Governor Brownback is, he's introducing the concept of we will, basically go from eventually, we want to eliminate our personal income tax, take that down to zero. Because what he's saying is Texas, and if you know anything about Texas, they have no corporate or personal income tax. California has lots of taxes, and obviously they have a fairly high income tax rate as well too. So that's the thing he's using. We want to look more like Texas. And so once Governor Brownback then is elected in November of 2010, and he assumes office. His first year in office, there is no specific acts to address the income tax that he campaigned on. But about a year ago, this time last year, he unveils in his income tax reduction plan. And you'll see up here is that he's making the income tax flatter, fair, and simpler. And he talks about the last decade was a lost decade for jobs in Kansas. Fewer Kansans are working in private sector jobs in January 2011 than were in January of 2001. Fixing that is our top priority. Okay, so he is saying, we've got to create these jobs. We're going to get there by the eventual elimination of the personal income tax rate. And so in his document that he publishes last year with his plan, he provides these guiding principles of reform. And they all sound, pretty straightforward and, common sense. He wants to streamline and modernize the tax code. But let's face it, there are a hodgepodge of credits and deductions and things out there that we can make the system simpler. He wants us, quote unquote, stop picking the winners and the losers. When you think about tax policy and how tax policy usually drive actions, he wants to start limiting those. He talks about basically he wants this to be a small business focus. And I think we can all agree that for particular types of small businesses, those that particularly use innovation, that spur innovation, they can create significant new jobs, high-paying jobs, and that's definitely a good goal to have. When he talks about income taxes, he says, families spend money better than the government, so by golly, if we can cut that income tax, we're going to put more money in the pockets of everyday working Kansans to make that happen. They can spend it better. They know how to spend it better than the government. The thing I guess I want to talk about, focus in on, is the fifth guiding principle reform. And this is the whole thing. This comes from Laffer Associates. Does that name Laffer ring a bell? Yeah. Okay, well that's Dr. Arthur Laffer. We're going to talk about Dr. Laffer in a minute. But basically what Governor Brownback is saying in his plan is he says states with zero personal income tax significantly outperform states with the highest personal income tax rates, bracket quotes, in terms of gross state product. Okay? They experience larger than average population growth and boost state tax revenues at a faster pace than high tax states. Okay, and that's what Laffer's whole thesis is used to drive this. Okay, so now who is Arthur Laffer? Okay, well, just his educational background, got his BA in economics at Yale, went on to get his MBA and PhD in economics at Stanford. Known for the Laffer curve. You folks know what the Laffer curve is. Basically this concept of, you have a zero tax rate, you have a 100% tax rate. At both of those 2 points, if you're a taxing entity, you're not going to generate any tax revenue at all, right? Because there's nothing to make it or no incentive to do it. And what basically Laffer said is at some point in between those 2 points, you can maximize the tax revenue. So that was one thing he's known for. And actually back in 1974, he actually had a meeting with Dick Cheney, at that time was then Deputy Chief of Staff for Gerald Ford, and he started talking to Cheney about basically some of these concepts, which George Bush, President Ford, wanted to go for derisively as voodoo economics. But Arthur Laffer is also considered the father of supply-side economic theory. Okay, what is supply-side? What supply-side said is that basically, hey, if we want to achieve economic growth, we want to basically get out of the way of the job creators. Okay, so those producers of goods and services, we basically want to lower those disincentive barriers. And so what that means to supply side folks is basically, number one, we want to eliminate and eventually get rid of income taxes. We want to get rid of capital gains taxes. We also want to get rid of regulations because, once again, those in the supply side vernacular, those restrict economic productive output. And so when you basically tie this supply side theory together with the Laffer curve, when you talk to a supply side theorist, they always think they're on the wrong side of the curve. They always basically predict that, by golly, if we cut that tax rate even further, we'll get even more revenue into the government coffers. And then finally, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but our state of Kansas actually paid Laffer Associates $75,000 to assist in the development of the governor's tax plans, of which supply side theories prevalently drives. Now, I want to show you this book here real quick called Eureka, How to Fix California. This was the book that Dr. Laffer actually came out with in early last year. And these are, this is basically his hypothesis. Once again, he's making the case that if you look at these 9 states of no personal income taxes, okay, and look at this number here, the gross state product growth. What Dr. Laffer is saying, look how much higher that growth rate is. And by the way, this is data from the decade of 2001 through 2010. What Dr. Laffer says, he's saying, because these states have no personal income tax, look at how much stronger they are from an economic standpoint, okay, as far as that percent growth development versus the U.S. average, versus Kansas, and by the way, versus these 9 highest personal income tax states, okay. And once again, his book, How to Fix California, California is one of those 9, high PIT states. So that's what the premise is on. So not only is Dr. Laffer, talking about California, but he conveniently seems to stop in all these other states throughout the country, right? And talking about how that non-income tax state should be more like this. He does that, in Missouri and Arkansas and a number of other places. But my point is that's what he's talking about. And so you also see he makes these arguments because of this higher GSP rate. You have higher population growth. And by golly, there's that old Laffer curve to look at how much additional growth we see in state and local tax revenue because we have eliminated that tax rate. So let's kind of start looking under the hood. I mean, it all looks good on the surface, but once you open the hood of the car, let's check it out. Now, these are the 9 no personal income tax states. Okay, you see the 9 there. And what immediately jumps out to you about this data set is that you would think that these states would be, I guess, more consistent, more congruent in these data points. But what you start to see is you see some really big outliers in some of this data. Okay, for example, look at the GSP for Alaska, 77%. Nevada, nearly 60%. Look at Wyoming down here, 105%. Okay, but you look at the rest of those no-income tax states, they really don't look any different. In fact, some of them are lower than the U.S. average. Same over on the population growth. You have Nevada with incredible population growth. You have Texas with incredible growth. Okay, the other states, they're maybe a little bit at or above. But those are the outliers for that data. And then finally, over here to state and local tax revenue. Look at some of these. 450% growth in Alaska over that decade. And there's all good reasons for that, and we're going to get into that. But so what Laffer does is he does these simple averages of these numbers, okay, and comes up with the answer on the bottom here to justify his results. But as you can see, outliers drive the average of the number and really pump that up for the group. So let's talk about some of these so-called these no-income tax states the governor wants us to try to be like. Let's look at Alaska. Alaska is the second least populated state in the union, about 720,000 folks. Alaska leads the nation in state and local tax revenues. And once again, folks, they have a wealth of minerals up there, right? They're all about oil. And so when you look at Alaska, 53% of their state and local tax revenues comes from minerals. Okay? Comes from minerals, 53%. State of Kansas, our severance taxes on gas and oil are less than 2%. So when you keep on going down the thing here, you learn more about Alaska. Oh, gee, by the way, domestic crude oil prices rose over 200% during that decade. So when you start talking about your growth and state and gross state product, okay, gross state product is nothing more than a value add of the goods and services that are sold during that period. You can keep your oil production exactly the same, but when you've got domestic crude prices rocketing that big, okay, your GSP growth is going to look incredible. Okay, and that's what happened in Alaska's case and why they're on this, so-called state of emulated. What's interesting is that while, our governor and Art would talk about, we want to drop our income tax, what you see with a lot of these states, they're no income tax because of other things that have occurred or things that have happened. So, for example, like with Alaska, they had an income tax until they implemented their Trans-Alaska Pipeline project. And then once that came online, they had the severance taxes from that they could rely on. They could get rid of their income tax. Let's talk about Florida. Okay, our governor's talking about, we need to be like Florida. He has said that a couple times. Well, think about what that means. Florida has over 1,300 miles of coastline, over 650 miles of sandy beaches. Okay, tourism, over $70 billion a year tourist economy. It also has over 82 million visitors each year. There you see there in 2011. So what does that mean from Florida and their taxing scheme? Well, what it means is, first of all, you got a lot of out-of-state homeowners who have property down there. And obviously you also have a lot of visitors coming in from out of state. So Florida is basically going to evolve their taxing structure basically to tax out-of-state residents. By the way, too, we all know that Florida is a major retirement destination. I don't foresee Kansas becoming that anytime soon. But, they are. So when you look at basically Florida's tax revenue, okay, once again, over 85% of their state and local taxes come from sales, nearly 50%, and property, 36.8%. Once again, because so many out-of-state people are paying that, okay, they can afford to forego the income tax. Okay, let's talk about Nevada. Nevada is the one state from a population standpoint that has a population relatively consistent to Kansas, about 2.7 million people. Once again, there are some anomalies with Nevada that Kansas will not be able to enjoy. First of all, we don't have anywhere the gaming revenues they do. They have, nearly $825 million in gaming they get each year. They have tourism at $2.4 billion, okay, and state local revenues they got in 2010. We just don't have that tourism economy here in Kansas, and, unfortunately never will. Once again, Nevada, interestingly, has turned into a retirement destination, okay, over the past 20 years, but there's a reason for that. It's because they're good neighbor California. People have been leaving California. It is a high-tax environment. And we see some interesting things that actually have drove, once again, Nevada has a particularly high GSP as well, too. What has happened in Nevada, though, when you look at their population, goes like 30% over the last decade. But half of those people are coming from California. And so what you saw happen in Nevada during the last decade is you saw a lot of new home construction occur in Nevada, okay? And what was going on at that same time? You saw that whole, easy, financing with homes and stuff like that. And so you see this housing bubble, okay, start to build. And finally, in 07, 08, that bubble comes crashing down. And so following now, you go out to Nevada now, it's not looking too great out there. In 2010, they had the highest unemployment in the nation at 14%. Their still highest unemployment of a little over 11%. Their home mortgage foreclosure rate in 2010 was 50%. All right, so just huge cycles up and down. Fortunately, we don't have to experience that here in Kansas. But once again, when you look at the home building out there, because the in-migration from California, that has driven a lot of their GSP. Let's look at Wyoming. This is another example of a mineral-rich state that skews the results for these no-income tax states. They're the least populated in the country. They're the biggest coal producer. You see that up there. Once again, look at the coal prices up here. State coal prices rose over 120% over the last decade. Once again, that's a big driver for your GSP. That's why they stand up so good. Look at the minerals here. Minerals, their mineral wealth comprise 31% of their state GDP and 38% of their state revenues. Okay, once again, that's 17, 18 times what we can do here in Kansas. That's not our state. And finally, we've all heard about the Texas miracle. Governor Perry down there rode that horse when he was running for president. And so our governor obviously has said, numerous times, we're going to be more like Texas. Well, once again, let's take a look at, what Texas is about. And they have some really impressive results down there. After the recession in 2009, over a third of the jobs created nationwide since the recession came in Texas. Their economy was growing at twice the rate as the national average. Well, what does Texas have going for it? Oil and gas. Once again, because we've seen domestic crude prices jump up so much, you've seen just an explosion of that industry down there. And so what you have now is basically, in the past decade this was measured, when you look at that whole oil and gas industry, you think about all the tax revenue sources between severance of the minerals themselves, as well as income and sales tax from the workers down there, that industry with all those people, that finances 20% of their state budget. Now, their actual severance percentage is, once again, 8%, but once again, that's 4 times what we have here in Kansas. Those are figures for the times. But Texas has many other things going for it that, once again, that, we're not going to be able to enjoy. Let's talk about tourism. Once again, Texas has that shoreline thing going for it. They've got about 360 miles of shoreline. If you look at the actual beach property they have with all the bays down there, they have about 3,300 miles of inlet beaches. Once again, lots of vacation and tourist attractions that we just don't have here in Kansas. Federal spending. Lots of federal installations, as you can imagine, down in Texas, be it both federal and civilian agencies. A big drive of their economy. Shipping. Texas has 14 port cities on the Gulf. Houston is the largest export port in North America. Once again, that's a whole other avenue of industry that we don't enjoy here in Texas. Finally, Kansas. Sorry. Finally, then you've got, once again, you have a retirement destination. Texas, like Florida, like Nevada, for the past 20 years or so, it has turned into a retirement destination. And as you see retirees going to these states like Florida, like Texas, you also see an additional need for basically workers, okay, to support that aging community. And so those help drive GSP as well, too. The other thing that really sticks out on Texas's population growth is they have a very large Hispanic population, 38%. And their birth rates are significantly higher than other ethnic groups. So that also as well, once again, just bursts, fuels increases in GSP. So when we start looking at the LAFR data, and once again, these are numbers all out of this book. Okay, I didn't put any of this together. They all came out of here. Once again, the no personal income tax states, that's the original numbers. But let's start backing out these states that we will never be able to aspire to be. And I would argue, first of all, we need to basically knock off Alaska, Wyoming, and Texas because we don't have those mineral wealth. We don't have that things that they have. So once again, when you take out those three income tax states, you're left with 6 of them. And these are the rates now you're looking at, your GSP growth, your population growth, and your state and local revenue growth. So look at that. Just those 3 states, you've had almost a 10% shrinkage in the GSP. Population growth hasn't fallen all that much. But look at the state and local tax revenue growth. This really emphasizes, that's a 55% drop there. That really emphasizes their reliance on minerals and the severance tax, which once again, Kansas will never enjoy. Now take it one step further, and let's get rid of the 2 states that have the big tourism economies. Because once again, I just don't think we're going to have that 700 miles of sandy beach line that Florida has. And we won't have those gaming revenues that Nevada has and being next to California. So you get rid of those states. So basically what you're left with on this line is you're left with the no income tax states of New Hampshire, South Dakota, Tennessee, and Washington. And those are the GSP growth percentages. So 45.03, you have the 865, and the 57.57. Look at those 3 numbers there. Now, look how that aligns with the U.S. average. Look at Kansas. Look at the 9 highest PIT states. Okay, it's all in the ballpark. It's all in the neighborhood. So basically, I would use this point to argue that what Art Laffer is basically presenting is, in essence, a false analogy. Okay, when the governor says we need to be like Texas, I think he's saying a false analogy. Let me use this example, and I hope you find it relevant. We've all seen NBA games and, what those guys can do flying up and down the court, right? Well, I'm 51 years old. I happen to play a Saturday morning pickup league with a bunch of guys my age, all right? Now, if Sam Brownback were to come up to me and say, Tom, you can jam just like Kobe, okay, if you put on, Nike Dream Season 4 Kobe sneakers, now I couldn't even touch the bottom of the net, let alone hit the rim. But I think that's in essence what he's saying when he says, by cutting your income tax, we can be like Texas. Once again, Texas has specific characteristics unique to that state, to its citizens, that we just will never have. And so you won't see that performance. So there have been some other groups that have talked about basically this whole phenomenon, this whole supply side concept that certain people preach about. Once again, we get to zero in the income tax, we'll have this growth. Missouri is fighting the same thing that we have over here in Kansas. Since 2011, even before then, the legislature has talked about wanting to go to zero income tax. So they have a nonprofit there called the Missouri Budget Project. This is an economic development group that are very much into, they think they ought to be investing in infrastructure and not giving out tax cuts. But they did their own study. They basically came to the conclusion that on their study, they actually looked at gross state product per capita. So they basically looked at on an individual basis and they looked at all the states across the union. And what they came to the conclusion is there is no correlation between a state's utilization of income tax and its rate of economic growth, i.e. a state cannot cut its way to prosperity. Okay, it doesn't exist. That's what they came to the conclusion. Now, you'll also recall, we had the debate, the presidential elections, and there's a lot of folks in Congress running around saying that, hey, if we just, drove our federal income tax rates to zero, or, lowered them, we too can create jobs. The Congressional Research Service is an analytical arm of the U.S. Congress. And they came out with, the original study was published, I want to say September, October, Some folks squawked about it, they pulled it back, but then they republished it on December 12th. And here's what they said about this whole notion of cutting marginal tax rates. They said, this analysis finds no conclusive evidence, however, to substantiate a clear relationship between the 65-year reduction in top tax rates and economic growth. So once again, it doesn't exist. They go on further to say, I found this really interesting, that the top tax rate reductions appear to be associated with the increasing concentration of income at the top of the income distribution. So basically you have, the very few getting more and more and more versus, the rest of us all lumped together. So there's, you see a widening of the wealth gap. So once again, just to recap, we talk about traits of states without income taxes. Typically, these states, they have what I will call a significant fourth revenue stream, be it minerals, tourism, gaming, etc. They typically have higher sales and property tax burdens as a percent of their total overall tax mix. And they'll shift that tax burden to either non-residents, like we see in places, like Florida and Nevada, or they basically end up sticking to the resident middle class and the working poor. And once again, when you look at basically, this is a chart summarizing those 9 known income tax states. I want to point out once again, when you look at Alaska and we look at Wyoming here, these are the two, the big mineral-rich states. When you look at, this is Kansas on the bottom. This is their mix, property, sales, and other. Once again, income isn't on here. But you look at, say, Alaska, their property and sales tax are incredibly low. Why? Because they have all that severance tax over there. You see the same with Wyoming, basically, 30%, okay, and that severance tax. Now, Wyoming's property is a little bit bigger. But the point is that they're able to really, they have a source that more than replaces an income tax. But for most part, all these other states, you'll see that their burden of their overall tax mix, they rely more on property taxes than Kansas does. They rely on sales taxes a lot more than Kansas does. Now let's talk about Governor Brownback's bill that he signed into law last year. This is Senate Substitute for House Bill 2177. We're going to fly through this and get your questions. I know I'm probably dragging this out too long. But basically, before the last year's tax list, we had 3 tax brackets. We had basically 3.5, 6.25, and 6.45%. Basically, we took those 3 brackets down to 2. I say we, I didn't vote for it, but the legislature did. And we reduced the rates down from based on 3 and then 4.9%. So by seeing this constriction of the brackets, by having the rate reduction of marginal taxes, this portion annualized of the tax bill last year costs us about $800 million annually. Okay? Once again, when we have a $6.2 billion annual budget, that's about what, 13, 14%? So that's a chunk of change. The other second interesting part of this tax bill that was signed into law last year is it exempts all pass-through income. Now, I heard Governor Brownback and his tenant talk about one of his basic tax foundation blocks is that we need to basically incentivize small business. Well, so what they have done to incentivize those quote-unquote small businesses is saying, hey, if you're called a closely held corporation or partnership, okay, you don't have to pay any income tax on what they call non-wage income. So basically what we're saying is on your non-wage income, there's no personal income tax to be paid. So basically, if you own an S-Corp, partnership, LLC, sole proprietorship, if it's non-wage, okay, you don't have to pay an income tax on it. So we get into some interesting situations. Okay, and then the other thing we did with the bill, basically the standard deduction was raised for married head of household, not single filers. So who pays income taxes on this deal? Basically, we're talking, say, we have like the doctor's office. Our receptionist is paying an income tax. The doctor is not. Typically, they're going to be, once again, they'll have a partnership or so that's they're involved with, so the non-wage won't be taxed. Once again, the lawyer's office, you have the paralegal paying a tax, the law firm partner not. You take that one step further, have a judge or a prosecutor, they're paying income tax, and that attorney isn't. So typically we have wage earners being taxed at a reduced rate, but we also then on the non-tax any of these small business owners or partners. And some of the things, so basically once again, when we talk about that pass-through, once again, that income tax, that costs the state about another $180 million annually. Okay, so right now we're up to about $980 million annualized cost for the tax bill passed last year. Now, there were elimination of a number of individual tax credits to basically try to get some of that money back. Okay, unfortunately, I think some of this was somewhat regressive, but you be the judge. We got rid of something called the food sales tax rebate. And basically what this does is for basically our poor families, this saved the state basically about $58 million. Okay, but basically what this is, we have about 380,000 Kansans that qualify each year for this. That will be gone and taken off the books. Child dependent care credit disappeared. We have, oh, by the way, back to the home sales tax rebate. We now have the dubious distinction of Kansas joining Alabama and Mississippi as being the only states that fully tax food and not providing our working poor any sort of rebate or relief on that. We got rid of something called the homestead property tax refund for renters. This was basically an income tax credit of about, I want to say about $300 or so per filer. A lot of elderly, people on fixed income, disabled folks utilize that. That was taken away. The adoption credit went away. And there's a whole other raft of repealed tax credits that no longer can be taken under this. We'll just fly through that. So as you see for this, so basically when you get rid of all those individual tax credits, that quote-unquote saved the plan about $180 million. Okay, so we're kind of back to this plan a little bit north of $800 million, the first year annualized cost for the tax plan. And so when you look at basically the income shifting here, okay, once again, we've had a lot of tax cuts handed out. So basically you see obviously by far, most of the population benefits from this tax cut. Okay, now albeit it costs a whole heck of a lot of money, but most of our citizens benefit from that. You're seeing here the lowest 20% of our income earners, they have a little bit of an increase because we've gotten rid of those tax credits. So kind of carrying on here, I'll just fly through this. One of the interesting things, Tax Foundation, they're actually a conservative tax group, actually funded by some Koch entities. They weren't too keen on this. They didn't like the fact that we were rewarding certain business structures tax breaks and not others. They didn't understand that point. We have our own Martin Dickinson, professor of law at the University of Kansas. This guy is a nationally recognized family estate planner. He believes we're going to have the most progressive tax systems in the nation starting in 2013. And then a more progressive group, Institute of Taxation and Economic Policy, talked about we're cutting over $660 million a year by actually increased taxes for low middle class families. Kansas media just kind of cut through this. I mean, it was kind of a mixed bag feedback on, what certain newspapers talked about this. Forbes magazine, business magazines, they talked about basically, once again, slashing tax rates for certain earners while increasing the burden on other folks. They once again point out the thing about the food sales tax rebate disappearing. Moody's had an interesting, they're the rating service, they had an interesting take on this. They felt because there is such a revenue deficit with this plan, they're concerned about the spending cuts and how that's going to shrink Kansas government. They're concerned about our shrinking public sector in Kansas is going to stymie our recovery for further economic growth. And once again, the whole thing about this helping small businesses, once again, let's go back to that definition of what a small business is. Under the Brownback tax plan, it's a closely held or a pass-through entity. Basically, a pass-through entity is a business entity where you're reporting your income on your individual return. And so who are these small businesses? Well, we know when you're talking a small business defined it this way, nearly 70% of S Corps and partnerships actually belong to entities with more than $50 million in assets. So in hindsight, we've got some really big small businesses out there. Okay, they're going to be joining tax breaks with us. And also talk about 42% of total U.S. pass-through profits earned by business entities. And once again, these are businesses with profits of $10 million in annual receipts or more. Okay, that's not a small business. And so let's look at on the U.S., you'll be familiar with some of these names, but these are some small businesses that would qualify, okay, under this tax plan. PricewaterhouseCoopers, right? They're a partnership. You see Feral Gas, our neighbors over in Liberty. Coors Technical Ceramics firm out of Colorado. This is a former Wall Street company that actually I think went public. But at the time, that's how big it was. And McIlhenny, the Tabasco sauce makers, that's how big those guys are. They're a small business under this deal. Now let's talk about Koch Industries. Okay. Once again, Koch Industries itself, their general counsel has intimated that they are a corporation, they pay corporate taxes. So I'm going to assume that they are a C Corp. But what's interesting about Koch Industries is that they are a huge conglomerate, okay, made up of many businesses. And those businesses total $100 billion in revenue. Some of those big, small businesses would be, I'm sure you've heard of Georgia Pacific, paper products company. They acquired that firm in 2004. They took it private. That firm had $20 billion in annual sales at the time they took it private. There's a firm from the Netherlands, Invista. I think they're the largest spandex, makers of spandex in the world. They have like an $8 billion annual revenue stream. Once again, that's under this as a small business under this subsidiary conglomerate umbrella. So anyway, we go back to our friend Dr. Laffer here in his younger days and ask about, hey, what about that job growth? Because if you really buy the whole supply side thing, you would expect to see this torrent of new jobs being created, right? Well, interesting, the administration came out with their estimates for new jobs. They said, hey, we'll create 22,000 new jobs by 2020. Well, let's put that in perspective. This past year, in 2012, we created 4,900 jobs without this tax plan. So I'm not really catching any material job growth coming out of this deal. Hopefully, for everybody's sake, I'll be proven wrong. Let's talk about the fiscal implications of this. Once again, when we look at the implementation of this bill last year, okay, this is basically the cost of this bill each year. So just a little bit of it went into effect here for the tail end of fiscal year 2013. This would be through the end of June 30th, 2013. So we haven't seen the effect of all those. Obviously, those tax cuts take effect. But when you fully start annualizing this tax bill, you see a cost of $800, and the cost just goes up annually on what this tax bill is going to cost the state of Kansas. And so once again, over a 6-year run of this tax bill, we're going to forego about $4.5 billion in income tax revenues by implementing this bill. And once again, you keep in mind, our state general fund budget is a little over $6.1 billion itself. It's a significant broadside of our revenue sources. And so when we look at immediate projected deficits, we kind of head south there pretty quick. Let me see if I got this. So basically in 2014, once again, in fiscal year 2013, we had an ending balance, I want to say somewhere around $500 million. I can't remember the specific number, but a rather healthy ending balance. But if you keep, these projections are based on, we had a flatline budget spending, and we realized that the governor's supposed savings from CanCare, okay, and if we got no new revenue sources, would be $261 million in the whole in 14, and then the deficit just climbs and climbs and climbs. So by 2018, if we had no changes to the budget, year after year, we'd have a $2.5 billion deficit. But we know that Kansas can't have deficits because it's in our Constitution. So we must balance the budget. So our options are to raise revenue and or make cuts. And when we start making cuts to services, what does that mean? It really means we're shifting services to local government units, which you guessed it, means local property taxes rise faster, local sales taxes rise faster. Now, folks in Johnson County are blessed with a very rich property tax base. Most other counties in Kansas aren't. So this will be, this is going to be a challenge for everybody as we go on this path. Once again, if you think about going to zero on that income tax, that's half of our state revenue. And what that means as far as shifting that tax burden. So Governor Brownback, he has offered a number of what he calls pay-fors to pay for this. He wants to basically raise the state sales tax back to 6.3. Right now, it's supposed to fall off and expire to 5/7, July 1. He wants to keep that where it's at. That would give us $262 million. He wants to eliminate mortgage interest deduction off of filers, so that's going to save another $162 million, bring that in. He wants to eliminate the property tax deduction, that's $68 million. And so basically in his tax plan, Senate Bill 78, this stuff will be implemented for tax year 2014. He also has some other budget things he's doing. He's basically grabbing funds from off budget to help pay for items in the state general fund. We're shifting some capers, obviously pension fund costs to gaming. One of the things he's doing is basically he's taking some state highway fund monies and paying for transportation costs under the school finance plan. But as part of the Senate Bill 78 that has some of these revenue enhancements in it, he is also proposing to drop the state income tax even further. So you remember that rate of the, for the low rate at 3%, he wants to take that down to 1.9 over a 2-year period. And that top rate of 4.9%, he wants to take down to 3.5%. So what you end up getting if you, the numbers I have seen from the Legislative Research Department is basically that tax plan, what this would do is that it gives us money to plug the near-term holes in the budget that I showed you earlier. But in the out years, by fiscal year 2018, we are looking at a deficit in that year of about $790 million. We just fall off a cliff at the end of fiscal year 2018. And so the question I pose to you, and once again, this is why we're here, is I'm trying to start a dialogue conversation, is that what would you do? What revenues would you raise? Where would you cut? And so once again, when you look at our state, at the state level, we see education is 62.3%. Once again, 53% is K through 12. About 10% of that's higher ed. We see the human services, that's our Medicaid. That's how much that is over there, 25%. We see other much smaller slices of the pie, public safety, this would be prisons and things like that. And then we have these other areas, general government and other things. So, in a nutshell, that's the decision we are faced, is that we have implemented these supply side income tax cuts. And once again, the governor tends to, he talks about this glide path to zero, that somehow we're going to keep reducing these till we're down to zero. And yet we're supposed to make our government operations run day to day. And so to get there, unless we have this huge economic explosion, okay, what does that mean? That means two things. It means basically a cutting of services at the state level, some of which will be shifted to the local level. It also means a shifting of the tax burden, which we're already doing. You're seeing he wants to keep the sales tax rate where it is and so letting it fall off. Okay, he's talking about getting rid of some of the itemized deductions. Okay, so, I mean, it's a shifting of the tax burden. So, this is what we're faced with as a state. And so, once again, I need to wrap this up now. I very much want to thank you for being here tonight, but I just strongly encourage you to, don't take my word for it. Go out, research the issues, learn about this own, form your own opinions, develop your own conclusions, and then please go engage your representatives and your senators and tell them what you think we ought to do. So thank you so much for being here tonight. We're going to open up for questions.